Good morning, all.
Okay.
All right.
Here, Michelle.
Woohoo! I won't be too loud.
My name is Tim Wilson. I'm the editor of Dark Reading. Michelle.
I'm Michelle Schaffer. I'm the Vice President of the Security Practice at Merritt Group, which is a boutique marketing communications firm based in Washington, D.C. We also have an office in San Francisco.
Thanks for coming this morning. It's great to see a great crowd. My mom is from Richmond, and so it's really fun for me to be back here and see everybody. But we are going to do something a little different than probably what you've seen in the other sessions. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about the sausage making that goes behind the coverage of security. You know, you're influenced every day by what you see, where you get your information, what you know about current events in security. More importantly, there are probably executives or people who have some power over you who read stuff too, and so you have to deal with them. So what we really want to do is leave you with some ideas on how to deal with that when executives come to you and say, I see this in the New York Times, I see this in the Wall Street Journal. Give you some tools to understand how some of that stuff gets to be news and how the media is influenced and how it works. And so I'm going to bash the media quite a bit here because everything we do is not good. Everything we do is not right. So even though I'm from the media, I'm not here to, I'm happy to answer any questions about how we do things, how we could do things better. I'd be happy to hear what you guys have to say. And Michelle, obviously, with her influence on the media, with working with multiple security vendors, you know.
Yeah, it might be helpful if I give you guys a little bit of context on what I do every day. So as I said, I'm heading up a security practice of about 6 to 8 people on both coasts. And at the end of the day, what we really do is PR, public relations. And we're working with about 10 security clients right now. And we're talking to people like Tim and his editors every day, and we're really trying to get our clients in the news. We have a lot of thought leaders that we represent, a lot of people with interesting perspectives that can add value, and so we position our clients as thought leaders and spokespersons to talk about every breach under the sun, and there's quite a bit of those, as you guys know. Yesterday was OPM, and I'm sure there's a new one today. So we are really at the forefront of working with the journalists and helping them craft stories and helping them get in touch with the experts. And we do a lot more than that, but at the end of the day, that's what our clients love and that's what they pay us for. So.
All right, so she mentioned OPM. How many of you know that the Office of Personnel Management got hacked? And okay. Okay, mix of different things. I'm hearing CNN. A lot of people get their news from Twitter. It comes from all over the place. And and breaches, by and large, are the stock and trade of security news media, right? So, what we wake up in the morning looking for is what's the big breach of the day? How did it happen? What can we tell you about it? And that sort of thing. So. And of course, that's great business these days because there's nothing but breaches to talk about. The number of breaches is up. If you look at the Verizon data breach report, the incidence of breaches is up. The cost of each data breach is up. The size of the data breaches is enormous. So you're talking about the Anthems and the Sonys, and where you're talking about millions or tens of millions of records lost, lots of data exposed. And so, we look at that as being the hot news in security. So that's our mindset as journalists. We're looking for something that's big, something that you've heard of, something that seems to have a lot of impact, right? So that's kind of where we're going right now. We talk about some specific ones. The Target one, people are still talking about, right? They lost their CIO, they lost their CEO over it. It was very visible because of large numbers. So anywhere from 70 million to 110 million records lost. It resulted in lawsuits. There was a lot of, sort of back and forth. Sony, another great example, right? So we're, the possibility that, we didn't get to see a movie that we wanted to see, because of a hack or because of threats that were made to movie theaters here in the States from Korea. The hack of the data lost Sony a great deal of intellectual property, including the actual movies themselves in some cases. And then this was, not their first hack, too. A couple of years ago, they had one that was even larger than that. So, we're talking about brand damage, a lot of issues that fall out of that. And then Anthem, we all know $78.8 million records. There have been, just this morning, there was a good, we haven't checked it out yet, but there's been suggestions of connections between what happened at Anthem and what happened at the OPM. There have been a number of sort of fallout hacks coming from through Care First that have been connected to the Anthem hack as well. So, we're talking about, we're doing our best as media to give you the information that you need to understand where the hacks are coming from, how they're happening, and what you can do about it. But in a lot of cases, we don't have as much information as we should, right? So, and in a lot of cases, we're not telling you about the breaches that you need to know about. So if you look at Target, Target's sort of the iconic one, right? It came from a third party through an HVAC vendor. It created a lot of damage. It was sort of a poster child for, in some ways for what not to do, at least from some people's perspective. But there have been the larger breaches than that you may not have heard about. If you look at the eBay breach from around the same time period last year, more people affected than Target. Nobody talked about it, right? If you talk about Home Depot or some of the other big breaches that you hear about, you might hear about them, but for some reason, some stories get bigger than others. So one of the things that we want to do here is talk to you about why does that happen, and what do you need to know, when all of this stuff gets brought up to you by executives.
So who reports on the breaches? Obviously, people like Tim. And hopefully you guys can hear me. And there are a lot of cybersecurity journalists out there. In fact, the landscape has grown tenfold. I started doing PR and cybersecurity in 2003. And at the time, there were just a handful of journalists that were covering cyber. And now it's pretty much everyone because it impacts everything. And the reporters that we're talking to, they are looking for the big story, like Tim said, one that's going to draw, interest and a lot of readers, a lot of clicks. At the end of the day, a lot of the publications that we work with and the reporters, they're evaluated based on click-throughs. So it's really important that the stories that they write are going to get a lot of attention. And the reporters are looking for stories that'll interest the average person on the street or a business that everyone has heard of. So again, that's going to lead to more clicks, more interest from the general public. And they're looking for breaking news that has immediacy and immediate impact. And I think that that's an interesting thing to bring up now, because right now I feel like day in, day out, I'm fighting fires. I have a lot of clients that have great stories that can offer value to the media. But when I'm picking up the phone and I'm talking to reporters, they're covering the breach of the day. And there's, 3 or 4 big stories per day that they're tasked with writing. So the evergreen topics that I'm pitching, although they might have value and they are important, the reporters don't have time. They literally are just working, trying to crank out the next story, trying to really just, kind of file their story and be done with the day. And it doesn't end. Reporters are doing pieces at midnight. I was sending a bunch of quotes from my clients over last night to a reporter literally at midnight on OPM because he was going to file his story this morning. And then breaches are breaking, big news is happening on weekends. If you think about some of the big APT reports, they've happened either later in the day or on a Sunday afternoon. So the journalists are working around the clock now to cover cybersecurity. But at the end of the day, they really do care about, the impact and how many click-throughs they're going to get. It's also driven by advertising. The more content and pages that are served, the more money they're going to make off of them. So most journalists are looking at a specific demographic that will make them seem more unique to an advertiser. And then they're competing with each other as well, these different publications for advertising dollars. A lot of my clients ask me if they should even be spending on advertising. And, if you're a Symantec or a McAfee that has a huge marketing budget, of course you need to. But for a lot of the startups that I'm working with, they're really looking for PR to help drive the leads. They're not going to have a ton of money to spend on advertising with a lot of publications. So they're willing to put a certain amount of money per month at PR just to get them quoted and get good articles and coverage. So the key takeaway here is that the newest, most novel, and widespread threats really get the highest play. And I think you've all been able to see that through the big headlines that you read every day in the news. But really, are these the same priorities as the professionals in the room? Is this what you need to know to do your job better?
I think, the other thing that happens, in addition to the various breaches that we hear about is when we talk about security researchers, some of you may be researchers or work with them, it's not unusual for dark reading to get a new disclosure coming through our email, or someone who wants to find out how to disclose a vulnerability that they've discovered. And that can be, it's very different when you have, the marketing power of Symantec behind you, and they're willing to issue a press release and that sort of thing, as opposed to an individual researcher who's discovered something, maybe even more important, but it's very hard to get the movement that you need to let people know what you found. And so that, you can be affected by who you have behind you, echoing what you're saying. So you have this issue, and I always sort of call it, the Kim Kardashian sort of Lindsay Lohan, kind of factor. You watch your evening news, and there's stuff that you want to hear about. It's just salacious, or it's sexy somehow, and so people sort of vote for it. They vote for it by watching it, or they vote for it by saying yes to it in surveys or that sort of thing. But is that what you really need to know? Is that the kind of stuff that you really need to know? It's interesting over here, or it's the kind of stuff that you actually need to know for your work. And what my argument would be is that you're getting a lot more Kim Kardashian than you are getting the stuff like, the fact that the road, outside your house is blocked and you're not going to be able to get to work the next day. Some of the stuff that's out there that seems very, exciting and impactful and that sort of thing, it may not be the kind of stuff that you need to know in order to handle your particular organization. So, you look at something like Target, you got people being fired, you got a company that everyone knows, you got, consumers who are upset and drawing lawsuits and, that sort of thing. It's just sort of the poster child for, for news, and yet maybe not necessarily something that was really helpful to you. I mean, maybe it got you to think a little bit about your third-party connections. If Target was accessed through an HVAC vendor, maybe it got you to start thinking about, well, what are we doing to verify, the supply chain in our organization? So maybe it was helpful from that perspective, but in some cases it may not have been all that useful to you, as an item for you to work on that day. Yet you may have some executive somewhere saying, what are we doing about this? We need to know. And so this is the kind of disconnect that you begin to run into. And some companies are really good at PR. I mean, I mentioned eBay as an example of, a huge breach that kind of just slid by. Nobody talked about it, and partly because they have good PR.
Yeah, I just have to say candidly, it plays a big part in how big some news gets, and that's just because I've been on the front lines working with large companies that have had most recently big threat intel reports that we needed to get out and make a lot of hay around and get journalists to cover it. And the role of PR is to figure out, how can we get the biggest play for the story that we have, and are we going to pitch that as an exclusive to, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or, CNN Money. So we're trying to figure out, in order to help our clients, where we're going to get the biggest, bang for our efforts and our pitching. And a lot of times it is, going to those larger publications, trying to get them to cover the news. Oftentimes too, we are pitching the trades a lot. I'm talking to Dark Reading, I'm talking to CSO, I'm talking to eWeek. Those are really important because those are, the users of these technologies. What I thought was kind of funny around the holiday time, I was talking to a trade journalist, and when the Sony breach happened, all of these reporters got inundated with, the latest and greatest quotes from cybersecurity experts all over, from every vendor and every consultancy saying, hey, the Sony attack happened and I could have prevented it with X technology. At the end of the day, reporters see through all of that. They see it and they know that there was nothing anyone could have done to have prevented Sony. And that journalist said that he ended up getting a pitch from someone that said, quite candidly, they couldn't have prevented it. It was an awful breach. And it was actually really nice for somebody to be honest with him for once. To say, you know what? It's a horrible thing. We couldn't have fixed it. We couldn't have prevented it. The reporters do see through a lot of that FUD that the PR pros and the vendors are spinning up to them. So that's just something for you guys to know, because again, it feeds into this larger discussion. Don't exactly, accept everything you read that's out there, because a lot of it is spin.
Yep. And so let's talk a little bit about the sausage that gets made behind the scenes, where the news comes from, and how the media works. Bottom line, reporters are people, right? So, and they've got a job to do every day. I have to file 2 stories, or my people have to file 2 or 3 stories. So they're, in a lot of cases, they're taking whatever the low-hanging fruit is. They're being pumped full of information. They're seeing some of the same stuff that you're seeing on Twitter. They're getting information from the various vendors that are in the space. And we're getting information from researchers. If we're lucky, we have a pretty good network of researchers, so we have some sense for what new vulnerabilities are being reported. Day to day, you're on a constant deadline. You may not have time to go into the depth that you want to. Bottom line, we end up writing a lot of stories where we don't have a lot of information. OPM is a great example. So yesterday, OPM came out and said, well, we've had a breach. It happened back in April. We think maybe it was the Chinese. We don't know. It came from Chinese IP addresses, which we all know means nothing. So they're basically telling us very little that's useful. So we're reporting everything that we know. Of course, you're going to find 1,000 people who have an idea. This is what we think it was. This is how we think it happened. That kind of thing. But very little that's really reliable. So it's ironic, but a lot of the news that you see about breaches or things that are happening in security, even vulnerabilities, is very early. So you don't have, it's not baked. You don't know where the breach came from. The vulnerability that's being reported may not have been checked out by other experts yet. It's very early stuff, but we're reporting what we have, and so take it with a grain of salt. There's, you can look at it and say, okay, well, I know there was a big breach at OPM. It's got a lot of people worried. There are a lot of people whose data is out there, possibly, but that's about as much as we can say. And I'm at a point now where I've got some of my reporters going back and writing stories about breaches that happened, say, a year ago, because that's more useful to what you guys do than the latest breach. Because at this point, if you look at, say, state of South Carolina, that was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. They released the full Mandiant report that talked about exactly what happened. You can find out exactly how the breach occurred. You can go into some depth and really learn something from it, which is the goal of, if we're going to write breach stories, we want you guys to learn something from it. And so that's sort of where we're shifting our thinking, is that maybe you need to know more about what we really know about versus just what happens to be the breaking story.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, so, after OPM broke last night, in the next, couple weeks, months, there's going to be more information that's going to roll out. And the role of the PR firm or the marketing person that's, trying to get a client or a vendor in the news is to really piece together sort of that puzzle. So let's say it turns out that this was because of a spear phishing attack. Well, if we're working with, a anti-spear phishing company, they have the perfect opportunity to comment, and it makes sense for them to comment. So there are a lot of times where, breaches do happen, and, all my clients want to comment, but I have to temper them down a little bit because it may not make sense, because there's not enough information for them to be a reliable person to comment on the news. And so that's where, I counsel my clients, okay, let's wait and see. Maybe there will be some connections made in the next few days where maybe it makes sense for you to say, hey, my technology might have helped with that. So I think that's another perspective of it all, is that, connecting the dots. And that does happen in, day 2, day 3, day 8 stories. That's why reporters have to keep covering certain breaches over and over again as that news trickles out.
And if you look at the impact of a breach, it often changes a lot. If you look at, Anthem, for example, it started out that they said, well, it might be 1 million, then it was 4 million, then it was 7.8 million. These things change a lot, and you don't know right away all the details until they have either been shared by a reliable source, or there has been something like a Mandiant report or something that you can point to and says, this is how the breach occurred. So, the point there, take the breaking news that you see and follow up with it. Make sure you understand what the real impact was, how it really happened, because a lot of times you'll see, particularly from the CNNs and the NPRs and the people who are responsible for reporting stuff on the hour, a lot of the early reports will be not very reliable. And so there's a lot of stuff that sort of comes out that's widely thought to be true, and yet when you actually look back on it a month later, it wasn't. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about who influences the news. Who are the people that give us our information?
Yeah, I think I see one of them in the room here. His name is Chris Eng, sitting back there. So, Chris gets quoted a lot in lots of different publications, whether it's business press or trade or broadcast, because he's a reliable source, because people know that he's very smart. He knows what he's talking about. He's done great research through his company. That's what the reporters really want. They want people that they know they can trust, that have a valuable point of view. And they have them in their Rolodex. I'm sure Tim could call, 10 people within, 20 minutes and get the comments that he needs, or to validate a story that he's thinking about writing. That's just the way it is. And you see a lot of the same people that get quoted over and over again in news stories, and it's just because they're accessible and they have that, sort of thought leadership, that aura about them, and they're respected in the industry. So that does play into it. Twitter, of course, plays a big role in news, as you guys know. It's faster than any news outlet. I usually look at Twitter first thing in the morning, do a quick scan, so I can figure out, for my team, what are going to be the big headlines of the day? Which ones should we go after? Which ones are relevant to our clients? The buzz really does start, I think, a lot on Twitter. And it's actually really helpful, too, for PR pros like myself to sort of validate, whether a story is going to be big enough to even pay attention to. So there's a lot of, security influencers that will comment back and forth on Twitter and on social networks. I see them on Facebook, too, and LinkedIn. but you can see the smart people really sort of commenting on some of the news, and if, again, if they shut it down, if they don't think it's all that important, then I trust what they say because, I know them to be very smart individuals. And then there's individual people on Twitter that carry a lot of weight. People like Chris Hoff, people love him. He gets quoted quite a bit in a lot of stories, and people talk about him, and it's just because he's a big influencer. There's some other ones in the room too. So yeah, Twitter, social networks plays into news, and then other media. So I mentioned earlier that I had worked with the New York Times on an exclusive about a year ago. And exclusives are great if you really want to get that big bang for your buck story. You get it in one of those highly read business publications. But you also run the risk of irritating and making other journalists mad and having them play catch up. So the day that we broke the news with the New York Times, as soon as the news broke, as soon as her story came out, my whole team had to work in overdrive to call the rest of the reporters and tell them about the news so that they could cover it within that window. To them, it's, there's that hour to 2 hours to 3 hours to get a news story out. And, the influence of a Wall Street Journal or, USA Today or New York Times breaking something, they have to play catch up. That's just their job. And they're gonna have to report it even if they don't want to. What's funny that day is Reuters journalist over there talked to me and, pretty much had a lot of inappropriate cuss words because he was really irritated that he didn't get the story first. And so that, again, that's just how it works sometimes. It's unfortunate, but it's sort of the game that gets played behind the scenes on the PR side. And then, of course, search engines, that influences the news, Google rankings, Google News. That's definitely important. And a lot of the publications have to optimize their stories. So, when you look at a headline, it's basically what's going to pull up first in those searches when you're going to Google News and things like that. So it's really important. So the key takeaway here is just that reporters, they're influenced by the same stuff you are, what's on Twitter, what you're reading about, what's on the web, and what people are talking about.
One of the things you can do to kind of moderate what you're getting from a lot of the news media is have a really good set of people that you follow on Twitter. If the Dan Kaminsky's, the Chris Engs and the Chris Weissopels and the Jeremiah Grossman's, there are a set of people who are really smart, and they're very good about tweeting and calling out stuff that they see in the media that doesn't make sense or that they have a lot of questions about. And it's a great way to sort of temper what you're seeing in the media and have some weapons to go into a meeting with and say, well, maybe this isn't as big a deal as we hear about. The other thing that we can't emphasize enough here is that, most people don't go to publications the way they used to. You have, it used to be that, for example, dark reading people would pull up in the morning, and that would be their main source of information. We hope it still is, but realistically, it's a lot of Googling, right? You're looking for information. You know that something happened at OPM. You're going to Google OPM. You're going to get a whole list of stories, and so as a result of that, there's a lot of media jockeying to get to the top of that Google search, and there are a lot of folks who buy their way into that. So what you see at the top of your Google search isn't necessarily who's being most read, it's who shelled out the most money. And so, just take everything with a grain of salt. When you're doing your research, look for sources that you know are reliable, sources that you know don't go to, sort of the knee-jerk, stories and that sort of thing. So that you have, when you go into a conversation with somebody about, what the impact of a news event might be on your organization, you have some smart people who are weighing into your viewpoint. Let's talk a little bit about why stories get big. Why is it that we end up hearing over and over about some stories and others don't?
Yeah, some of these things we've already touched on. Obviously, the big numbers. When you see, a breach or a vulnerability that's going to impact millions of people, of course it's going to be big. I guess about a year and a half ago, I worked with a security consultancy on a Tinder vulnerability that they had found. And Tinder, of course, is the dating app, whatever you want to call it. But we knew when we were working with that team that this was going to get big play, that we were going to be able to go to more consumery and broadcast journalists to cover Tinder because, again, everybody knows it. Maybe they use it, maybe they don't. But it was something with big impact, and everybody knows it. So, and then big names, of course. You hear about breaches at the more well-known companies, federal agencies as well, because again, we all know these folks. And then, I think the retail and healthcare markets, of course, have had the biggest sort of breaches in the past, I'd say year and a half, and it all kind of started with Target, and then it was Neiman Marcus, it was Home Depot. So, those well-known, companies, they're definitely going to make more readers and bigger headlines. And then big claims, when you say that it's the first, biggest, or most dangerous vulnerability that you've ever found, or the biggest breach, which we saw with Heartbleed, and some of the follow-up SSL-type vulnerabilities in the past year, and those are definitely going to be stories that are going to get a lot of play, and they're going to be all over every type of publication. And then unusual threat actors. So I think there's a lot of interest right now in what's happening with nation-state attacks and cyber espionage. And I think we can blame our friends over at Mandiant because it all kicked off with APT1. And you've seen a lot of the threat intel providers push out similar types of reports over the past 2 years. Of course, Sony put it, I think, even more on the radar that the U.S. is under attack. And so consumers now are aware of these things, where before they probably didn't care and they didn't know. But I think Sony sort of changed the landscape. And then politically motivated attacks. So Anonymous, of course, a few years ago, there were a lot of stories about what they were doing in terms of cyber hacktivism against companies, organizations. HB Gary, of course, felt the brunt of that, unfortunately. And then highly sophisticated attackers, so Stuxnet. Obviously that one gets referenced probably the most when we talk about attacks on critical infrastructure. So those definitely do get big play. And the reporters have to build on these stories that are just going to get a lot of readers. It's their job, so they've got to focus on these big play type stories.
But the irony of all of that is that as you become more and more focused on, man bites dog versus dog bites man, the whole industry can tend to shift. And I think we're in that right now. We were in a situation where we were talking mostly about malware and viruses and the sort of the day-to-day stuff. And then with the development of FireEye and some of the discussions around sophisticated threats and Stuxnet and that sort of thing, we've become more and more focused on targeted attacks. We've become more and more focused on state-sponsored stuff and the most sophisticated, the advanced persistent threat, that sort of thing. And not that we don't need to pay attention to those things, but we have to remember that those are the 10%, the 5%, that those are the least frequent types of attacks, and maybe not mapping very well to what you deal with every day. You have to deal with the kind of malware, the automated malware, polymorphic stuff that is just constantly coming at you, and yet we're not writing about it in the news. You're not getting a lot of help in terms of what to do about it or which technologies you should be using, because we're all getting focused on the more interesting stuff. It's that sexy stuff, the shiny stuff that tends to get the most coverage. And so, as you begin to balance your priorities and sort of push back against executives who may see stuff in the news, that's some of the stuff that you need to start, that you're probably already having to deal with, is that, this isn't the 90%. This isn't the stuff that we have to deal with every day. So let's talk about, why does that happen? We talk about, it sort of starts with, a tweet, and then it gets sort of, megaphoned across the internet. And the next thing you know, it's the topic among all of us, security people, as well as people at the water coolers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we've already touched on this a lot, but yeah, it does start on Twitter, and the media vets the story ideas through those key influencers, the people they know, the people in their Rolodexes, that they can just, make sure that what they're writing is going to be impactful. I've had situations where journalists have actually called me and said, hey, what do you think about the story? Is it, big enough to write about? Or in other cases, they've actually called me and said, yeah, I saw so-and-so wrote on that story and she didn't report it correctly. There were a lot of inaccuracies in her story. So you know what? I'm not going to cover it because I'm not going to be lumped in with her and the other crowd of journalists that don't have their facts straight. So it's really interesting how that happens. So yeah, influencers might be influenced. And then search engines, we talked about that. The media spends a lot of time working on SEO. So do our clients. The marketing departments are always looking at search engine optimization. Every time I write a press release, we have to SEO it because, again, we want to make sure that it gets high in the rankings on Google search. And then crowdsourcing. So there's sort of this slash dot effect. If you get slash dotted, and you're quoted in the news, you're kind of a big deal. So, that definitely plays a role of it. And then competing for eyeballs. So everybody is looking for traffic. The journalists, they really do need to make sure that the stories they write are going to get a lot of clicks. And then some stories do get sensationalized. That's unfortunate, but that's, again, our message to you is be careful what you read because some of it is overhyped, which is probably a good term. And then, again, others are optimized for search engines.
So one of the things that happens is that we find that some stories, there's more information. So the OPM is a good example. So we wrote a story last night about OPM. This morning we found out that there may or may not be a connection between the Anthem hackers and the OPM hackers. So you'll probably see another story today or Monday. Target was another great example of where we wrote one story and then we wrote another story and then, Anthem is the same sort of thing. You're reporting new facts as you get them in, but what it does is it creates sort of an overabundance, a skewing of the news so that you hear more about certain things than you do about others. Generally, reporters find themselves, at the mercy of what other publications are covering. So, if the New York Times writes something, I'll generally feel like, okay, well, we at least need to address it so that, we give our angle, we give the actual technical angle on the story, and that sort of thing. So you get this sort of megaphone that sort of resonates across the web from certain types of stories. And reporters are reaching for stories that they know, that they have, where they have sources that are people that they trust, so they're sort of reaching for the same sources over and over again, so you find that you're hearing the same sources, stories over and over again. And they're looking for stories that are home runs, stories that are going to get those 100,000 page views or, 1 million page views or, however many. So, and yet, again, smaller breaches that may be of software that you have, technologies that you're using may not get covered. You can look at, databreaches.com. You'll see a lot of breaches that never get covered. And yet may be pretty useful to you in terms of understanding what the universe is or what's happening in other companies that are like yours, so that you can actually draw some conclusions on them. So, security pros. We've talked about a lot of the different ways that we get our information. It comes from a variety of different sources. But how you prioritize your response to those things is completely different, right? So, you have the sources that you're dealing with, you have executives saying, what are we doing about X, Y, and Z? We read about it in the Wall Street Journal. You have vendors who are telling you, we've discovered a critical vulnerability and you need to patch it as soon as possible. So you're dealing with vendors. You have compliance mandates that are responsive, so you have indicators that may be that something has changed and you need to make a change in your environment in order to stay in compliance. You have industry reports, notifications. You get stuff from CERT, or you get stuff from an ISAC, that's one of the organizations that supports your industry, and they may have data that's coming out. You're getting system information. Obviously, you're getting tons of event data all day long, and then there are news reports that you're dealing with. So the point that I'm making here in these two slides is that the influencers, the sources that indicate what's important to me as a journalist are very different than the ones that are influencing you. And so if you look at the news, it's one piece. Hopefully it helps you shape your priorities, but it's definitely only one piece of that whole picture. And so, for you to when people come to you and say, well, this OPM thing is really important, we need to do something about it, you need to recognize, kind of that the media isn't, the folks who are most intimately familiar with what you're doing. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Tim made a few of these good points already. The media doesn't know your environment. We don't know what you're dealing with in your security operations center, or what threats are coming at you. So these hot threats and these over-publicized breaches may not even impact your organization and what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. And then your top executives don't know the media, so they don't know how it works behind the scenes, how some of these stories, get really big, and how, the business press, if, again, the Wall Street Journal is saying, all right, this major breach happened, and your CEO is coming to you and saying, what are you going to do about it? Well, again, they don't know that, this story is maybe half-baked, and it doesn't even apply to what you're actually doing day to day. So you need to have your own filter. You need to recognize that what's hot in the media might not be what's important to you and your organization and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
So, a few takeaways. We talked a little bit about having a set of filters that are specific to your organization and your particular needs. That they may be Twitter folks that you think are particularly smart or know your industry really well. It may be certain publications that you find that are more reliable than others. It may be just a general filter that says, I only want data about these systems because this is what I have. Sort of the same thing that we're doing it with threat intelligence now, right? You have to you're getting feeds of all kinds of stuff, but you need to figure out what's relevant to you. And, quite honestly, when executives say, well, I saw this in the New York Times, you need to be able to say, sorry, it's not important to us. And, treat it more like, if you look at the financial analysts, that's the way they treat the news, right? If they have a certain set of investments that they're protecting, then they follow certain companies very closely, companies that you wouldn't even consider to be important normally in the general trade press. But for them, that's their lifeblood. And you're doing basically the same thing as creating your own filter, your own set of filters. So the impact of the news is basically depends on who you are.
So yeah, just to kind of try to wrap up, I know we have a few minutes left. What are you going to do if your organization is the victim of a breach? I think a lot of companies know that, either they have been breached or they will be, or they just don't know about it. And there's that phrase that we hear and read everywhere. So at some point, it probably will happen. It's important to think about, what will be the fallout from a crisis communications perspective on your organization. Again, we've worked with a lot of clients on crisis comms and, to sort of have a plan in place for when or if this ever does happen. Unfortunately, in security, there's a lot of vendors that have been breached. RSA is probably the poster child for it a few years back. It's unfortunate, but yeah, you have to have that plan, that crisis communications plan in place. You have to know how the media is going to respond. As soon as something hits the news, they're going to want answers and they're going to want them quick. You need to be able to disclose what you have to the authorities, but even less to the media. In that moment when you see your company in the headlines, there's that fear factor that okay, is my job going to be at risk because we got breached or something bad happened? But you have to maintain accuracy. You have to be honest. You have to have integrity, and you have to really communicate. A few years ago, I believe it was Bit9 who got breached. There was I know actually the woman who did the PR for them at the time. They did a lot of over communicating through their blog to their customers, their partners, and that actually was good in that sense. They disclosed what they needed as they knew it, and that was that open transparency, I think, made people feel a little bit of more comfort in that Bit9 was taking it seriously, that they were taking the right steps, and that they were doing the right things. So, and then whenever possible, if it does happen to your organization, turn the breach into a positive spin. So, Heartland, I think their CEO is probably the best example that I can remember. When they got breached, he actually went out and did a lot of public talks, and he said, here's what we did wrong, and here's what you can learn from our mistakes. And I think that helped the public feel like, all right, he's being honest with us. He's telling us, okay, we were wrong. We did these things wrong. He's trying to help other companies not make those same mistakes. And then you need to recognize all aspects of the potential impact. So think about what's going to happen with your investors. Think about the brand damage that might happen, the loss of trust amongst customers and suppliers, and then the loss of credibility. So you have to really think really broadly, if this ever does happen to you or your organization, about all of the fallout, and have that crisis comms plan in place, and be ready, at any point in time with it. It's something that every company should have. So yeah,
I think we've given you a sense for where some of these stories come from and how they work. Are there any questions that we can answer? There's one in the back.
Yeah, the last one here, I think everyone is aware that the public has a short attention span. This stuff happens every day, but if you're in this biz, you basically pick up something that there are several sources of year-long training data. I pick up the Verizon DBIR each year and take a look at the big picture of what's happening. Are you saying that there's not a market for that type of reporting? Because that's the big picture of what's happening. Can you do reporting on that, or just not get enough eyeballs?
I think we do, and it's certainly a dark reading. The problem is that there's so much of it. Almost every vendor that has a research organization issues an annual report, or some cases it's quarterly, even monthly. And so we're inundated as reporters, we're inundated with that kind of data. And so we do try to report on it. The reason that we focus so much on the DBIR is because it's actual threat data, or it's actual breach data. Those are real incidents. So a lot of the stuff that you see out there is surveys. It's were you breached last month? No, we weren't. And so for us, we try to filter it a little bit so that the data that you get when we write about a report is something that you can actually use.
So have you written on the DBIR?
Oh yeah, that's one of our big stories every year.
My PR firm, Merit Group, actually launched the DBIR and did the PR for it for 5 years. So it is probably the most cited, one of the most credible reports that's out there. So continue to use that, because I think it does offer a lot of valuable information.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.